Hello, Internet. Daniel with Driving and Dragons, and I'm here today with yet another D&D Reacts video. This time I'm going back to Seth Skorkowsky. Haven't been over to his channel for a reaction in almost a year, and thought it was time to step in and take a look. Now, Seth is one of the most respected YouTube TTRPG personalities and talking heads out there. And I say that instead of saying something like, say, Dungeon Tuber, because one thing that I really do think of Seth Skorkowsky as is he's kind of the prototype in a way, or not necessarily the prototype, but the benchmark. I look at Seth and I see the actual unscripted, unaltered, unpolarized form of the guy who's just been playing these games for a very, very long time and loves these games and developed naturally. Like he just walked in out of the game shop and was never part of X, was never part of Facebook or Twitter or anything like that, was never part of any of the various different OSR, New School Gamer, Bro SR, Raw Crowd, was never part of any of that. He came up, he went through the Hickman Revolution, he became a Hickman Revolution style narrative game master. And then now when he puts the information out on YouTube, it's very much system agnostic. 90% of his stuff can be used for anything. And then he plays and reviews just about everything under the sun. I would say that D&D probably only makes up maybe 10% of the content on his channel, if that. So this is definitely one where I expect to have a much more positive reaction and where I expect to agree a lot more than disagree, as has been the case with a lot of my reaction videos. So we're going to jump into his video on getting players invested, which really is one of those GM hallmarks that makes those long enduring games happen. You can run just about any kind of play style if you can get your players invested and have enduring games. You can have fun even if things go completely tits up if you can keep the players invested. And by invested, I mean that they interact with the game on the table level as opposed to entirely on the meta level. If the 4D role-playing crowd has anything that is strongly of merit that they bring to the table, it's that their play style is set about to force you to interact on the table level. I think it's ham-fisted, and I think it leaves a lot out. But at the same time, at least it does drive investment. So while you're here, hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. When you're done, click the links in the description and below to fly on over to Lulu and grab yourself a copy of Corvid Codex Volume 1, either in ebook or paperback. That's 7 pulp stories written by TTRPG gamers just like you, published by TTRPG gamers like you, and illustrated by TTRPG gamers just like you. So written kind of one of those for us, by us type things there. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get cracking, and we're going to bring in Seth Skorkowsky, the Getting Your Players Invested
YouTube comments like I do, and you start seeing a lot of repeat questions from game masters. How do I get my players to start caring about this NPC? Or how do I get them to care about their own characters as more than just a collection of stats? Or how do I get my players to start learning and caring about the game world lore? Essentially, how do I get my players invested? Hello, Internet, Seth Skorkowsky, and today we're going to answer those questions with 4, well, more likely 3.5 very simple tricks that you can begin employing in your next session that can get your players invested in the game. Originally, in my giant list of video ideas and rough outlines, these were framed as writing tips or storytelling tips that game masters could employ, and they have been on this list for years, waiting for...
Yeah. I think that's kind of the hallmark of when you stop being a guy with a YouTube channel and you start being a quote unquote YouTuber, and you want to talk about something that kind of hits you in the gut a little bit when you're like, oh my God, I'm a YouTuber. Sometimes it makes you want to question your life choices. But when you go from, I'm going to sit down and make a video when I'm inspired, or holy crap, I can't figure out what I want to do a video about, I don't have any ideas, to I have a pile in the corner of ideas that I haven't fleshed out yet, that's when you kind of know that you've turned into a YouTuber.
for a day when I could organize and articulate my thoughts into some sort of coherent video. And then finally, I realized that these ideas weren't about storytelling tips because they're more interactive than just telling a story to somebody, because they force your players to engage rather than observe it like an audience. And with that little tweak of what this list of tips and ideas was about, investment through interaction, and it finally clicked with me. And while you, or at least I, can definitely see the storytelling DNA in each of these tips, the original concept outline has since morphed into something that's just far better.
Yeah, and that's an important point that he kind of brings up there. I think it's an important point that a lot of game masters of all different skill levels and experience levels miss. Even in a narrative gameplay style, what drives the campaign and what drives the story is player interaction on the table level. It's not simply telling a story. You can't direct your players to move their characters into a specific set of decisions. That's railroading. It's unsatisfying. It leads to disastrous results. What you have to do is you have to prompt them to engage with the world, and then you have to react in a realistic fashion to those decisions that they make, so that they have a world to engage with. And I think the big thing is playing off of exactly what he said, you have to stop thinking of your players as players and start thinking of them as their characters. Start thinking about what is going to prompt them, what is going to get them to sit up and take notice and dive in and start thinking as their character, as opposed to thinking as a player running a character.
Just a nice little reminder that many times reframing a problem is often the best way to find a solution. Now, this video is going to be system neutral, so it doesn't matter if you're playing D&D, Outgunned Adventure, Call of Cthulhu, or Cyberpunk Red, the same general concepts apply here. So first up, when introducing a player to an NPC, most especially one that the player character already knows and has previously known for a while and has some sort of relationship with them, let the player identify that NPC's memorable attribute. Mike, you run into an old work friend from a previous assignment, a guy named Roger Grayson. You haven't seen him in years. And while you always did like him, you also found him kind of annoying. All right. Okay, so the game master is bringing in, some sort of old friend NPC that's a friend of the player character, probably with some sort of adventure hook in their pocket. And while the player character is supposed to have had some sort of history and relationship with this NPC, the player is now supposed to play them as if they know who this NPC is, and they're supposed to care about them in some way. So make the player decide and tell you a little bit about this NPC.
Okay, so starting off here, this is actually a pretty solid piece of advice. You'll notice one thing that is pretty important here. If you go back to my last reaction video to Roll Initiative, I called her out on one piece of advice where she said that you should never tell your characters, your player, how their characters think or feel. And I pointed out that this is another place where absolutism blows up in your face, because there absolutely are certain situations where you do want to do that. This is an example of that right here. You need to give that player a baseline off which to build this NPC, this character that they're now functionally introducing to the world. This is also a place where you can hook somebody from their backstory, if they have one, to throw in there, what company they worked for, maybe some other little piece of information that can flesh them out a little bit. But there's two things that are done by this piece of advice when you allow the character or the player to flesh this out a little bit. The first is that commits them to memory, because they build the thing, they build the NPC in their own mind. So that's going to affix that NPC in their memory. The second thing is, as Seth is saying here, it allows them to have more of a connection to it, because now they're starting to think on a third level. They're starting to think another level deeper. It's not just, this is me, this is my character. It's, this is me, this is my character, this is my character perceiving somebody else, which forces them to perceive the world from their character's eyes.
What is it about Roger that annoys you the most? Yeah. So he's got this kind of low-key competitive streak to him, man. It's kind of one-upsmanship about everything. Drives me nuts. Giving the player the power to create this detail about the NPC doesn't just save you the time of having to come up with something on your own that elicits some sort of emotion from the player as well as the player character that you want them to feel about it, but it gives the player some form of ownership of this NPC. They now have a reason to remember and feel some sort of affection towards this character, an NPC that didn't exist until moments before because they were just told about them, but now they're going to remember this NPC as something that they created. They've activated more parts of the player's brain. It's not just a memory of something that they were told about, but a memory of something that they helped create. And of course, this doesn't have to be only about NPCs that the player character already knows. This can just be part of the NPC's introduction. Todd, you're having a drink in your favorite pub when this just gorgeous woman comes walking up to your table. I mean, she is just breathtakingly beautiful. Tell me, what feature do you find the most striking about her? Her eyes. They look like Natalie Dormer's eyes. Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. Okay, so those gorgeous eyes meet yours, and she tells you that she needs your help. Lady, I will do anything that you tell me to. This could be a character feature, like a notable feature or some sort of personality quirk, or could just be a key memory with that NPC.
I will say this. You got to be real careful with that to a certain extent. Make sure you give good guidelines to those prompts with the way you ask the questions, because you're going to have players that really take things off the rails, especially if this is something you're newly introducing to your play style. This is something your players haven't seen you do before. If you're not careful, you'll have them creating joke characters all over your world, or not just necessarily joke characters, but unintentional joke characters where they've added features or something that are just radically inappropriate to what this NPC or this character is supposed to be doing in your world. And you want to be careful, because if you give a player that authority, if you give a player that agency to create something in your world, you don't want it to turn around and screw something up. A classic example is the now semi-famous argument that I have had with the 4D role-playing crowd over the existence of a pen on a desk. And my stance of, it doesn't exist because I said it doesn't exist because I'm the game master and I control the world. I don't necessarily have a reason yet why there's no pen on the desk, but there isn't one. Whereas their whole thing is, oh, I can create anything there. Well, if I've got a reason for it not to be there, I shouldn't have to come up for a convoluted reason why the pen doesn't exist or the pen doesn't work or the pen has this, that, or the other. You got to be careful with that, because when you hand that creation power over to your players, it's going to end up having negative results, and it's going to cause hard feelings and that sort of thing. When you turn around and you correct it and take it away, it's kind of like just deciding that they can't use an ability that their character has. It feels like you've taken away something that was given or earned.
Dweebles, you get a call from your old childhood friend Dale Kelsey. You haven't talked to this guy in like 10 years, but back in the day, the two of you used to raise a lot of hell together. In fact, when you were 16, you got picked up by the cops. Okay. What did you two get busted for? Okay. Yeah, I know what it was. So when we were thick Dave, this is such a simple trick, but one that gets the players instantly connected with the NPC. They now have a reason to remember this character, and everything else will begin crystallizing around that one fixed memory point from there. The trick is for game masters to first set the parameters. What is it that's essential framing for this player character to work with inside of when they're adding something to it? This NPC is someone that they like, an old friend, someone who's in a position of power over them, like maybe their landlord or something like that. Or maybe the player character is just sitting in a bar and a beautiful woman approaches them. And then within this framework, you ask the player to fill in some sort of key detail. And that is a game master. It's not a key detail that really matters that much to you because you're worried about, whatever the hook is or everything else about this NPC. It's really inconsequential for whatever it is you're intending to do with them. But this becomes the anchor point for whatever the player feels attachment to when they think about this NPC.
So if I'd have just waited a minute, he would have filled in the blanks on some of the things I just said. Notice how he said it's very important that you set that framework. Setting that framework is what keeps the players in the sandbox, so to speak. You want to talk about sandbox style play. The key of a sandbox is it does actually have edges. And when you start throwing sand out of it, all you have is a mess.
Next, we'll go ahead and move this away from NPCs to the player characters themselves. A popular Game Master complaint is that the players don't have any form of connection to their own characters. They might be a great character on paper, but they're also kind of faceless characters. But first, a word from today's sponsor, Lands of Evershade by Awaken Realms. Being a game...
All right, I like you, Seth, but we're going to need to skip the word from your sponsor. But you know what? Lands of Evershade, guys, maybe you should go check him out. Seth is pretty good about his a lot of his sponsors, and his ad reads are usually pretty not too terrible. But you know what? I ain't getting no money from Lands of Evershade, so we are gonna skip on by. Though we'll leave his ad up for just a second while I add a little piece here about the first section of what he said about bringing it to players. Part of this is you have to understand your players. You have to know your players. There are players who want a blank slate or who only care about their character in and of them as a vehicle to run in game. And you have to understand that, sometimes that player is not a bad thing to have at the table. You just have to work around that. One thing that I think is a major mistake is if you start trying to get a player invested in the game in a manner that they are not prepared to be invested in it. So in other words, if they're mechanically invested in the rolling of dice and the building of characters and that sort of thing, trying to get them invested beyond a very base level in the role playing or in the character development or the narrative aspect, a lot of times is just a way to drive a player off or to turn them into a problem player where they start messing stuff up intentionally because you're turning the game into a chore for them. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't expect a certain minimum amount of buy-in, but what I'm saying is that you're going to have very narratively invested players. You're going to have players who are very minimally invested. And the key here is to play to those strengths and to maybe rein back the one that's heavily invested without hurting their investment so they don't, become a story bully and take over everything. But at the same time is to just draw them that player that just is there for combat, basically, to pull them out of the shadows a little bit and make them think, which you can do with things like making sure that they have to describe their actions instead of just saying, oh, I want to try to persuade the guard. It's like, well, you need to tell me exactly what you're saying to him. I don't need a speech. I don't need you to write it out, but you need to tell me what you're doing. So let's go ahead and get this ad skipped and see where we show up.
Back to the video and getting your players more invested in their own characters. Describing something visually and actually truly visualizing it are not the same thing. The details, while they might sound complete at first, are still pretty broad stroke fuzzy. For example, so what does your character look like? He's tall and lean with a bald head and just covered in tattoos. Okay, so I think we can all picture this one, right? Tall, thin, bald head, covered in tattoos. We can see it, but now let's make this caricature into an actual person. How many tattoos would you say he has? Like 30, I guess? Okay, so out of his 30 or so tats, which one is his favorite? His daughter, Gracie. It's on his right arm. It's not a very good likeness, but after her and her mom died, that's all he's got left. Sometimes he likes to just look at it in the mirror and imagine the woman that she'd have become. While the character might have thought that they had a pretty good image of what this character was before, a few pointed questions, asking them to give specifics about this image is how the player now feels a connection to this character. Before then, the character's tattoos were probably just sort of a nebulous concept. There were a lot of them, but there was no real image of what any of those tattoos were and where they were. So the Game Master is simply asking the player to identify a single one of the player character's tattoos that they had some sort of emotional attachment to, and the player then gets to discover even more about their own character, making this more solidified as a person in the player's eyes.
Yeah, a fantastic piece of advice. Anything that makes them detail out something about their character is good, because the more the player creates the character as an actual person in their mind, the more, not only the more invested in the game are they going to be, and not only the more attached to their character they're going to be, but the more real that character becomes, the more they can see that person and they don't nebulously shift around and change from time to time and act out of character, so to speak. This is also a great place to weave more attachment to the game world in. So, for instance, I would say what I would add to this is, if you're going to ask like this character with all the tattoos and stuff like that, this is a place where you can weave in more about how that player fits into your game world. Like asking, it's like, do any of these tattoos have any kind of affiliation with any particular organization? And they may say no. But if they say no, it's like, okay, well, we know we're not affiliated with any gangs or anything like that. An example is in my current 3.5 game, I'm running Oriental Adventures, and we're in Rokugan. And I have a player who is, through some shenanigans, is actually a race that doesn't normally exist in Rokugan, but he's also attached to one of the great clans. So I had to ask him questions about how he's attached to the great clans when he's non-human. And this evolved into things like him walking around wearing a rice paddy hat because it covers the non-human ears that he has, and about ways that he was, was he discovered? That was one of the questions I asked. Were you born into this clan, or were you rescued in some way or found later and joined them? It's like, okay, you were a foundling. You were adopted after a fashion by the member of this great clan. That gives us more to peel off of. And now I've woven this atypical character into the game world.
So Game Masters, all you need to do for this is to simply listen for when your player is describing something, be it their character's appearance or what it is they're doing or some sort of item that they have. If they're wearing cologne, what type of cologne are they wearing? What does the cologne smell like? Or if the player character has a sword, what does the sword look like? Is there anything special about the sword or reason that they're carrying around this specific sword? If the player character is just sitting on their couch contemplating whatever their next move is going to be, what color is their couch? Green? Yeah, it's green, but sort of that old grandma floral pattern, if you remember that. And I actually got it from a buddy who'd had it for a few years, but he'd originally pulled it out of a dumpster. So it's all covered in all sorts of just weird mystery stains, and there's like big old square of duct tape that's holding one of the cushions together. The players might not know a single specific about their character's apartment, but they are never ever going to forget their nasty and beloved couch now.
One thing that I want to point out here, and it looks like it's good timing too, because it looks like he's about to move into the let them fill in the world details, which may touch on some of the things that I've already pointed out here. Talking about that couch makes me kind of laugh, but you'll notice that in each one of the little skits, the Game Master version of Seth pulls up the little notepad over the top of the GM screen and starts writing stuff down. That is a very, very subtle hint that is included in the video portion of his video here. You better remember this stuff, folks. These tips actually work really well to get players invested. Now, some of them are not going to be as easy because, like I said, people get invested in these games in different ways. You got a mechanically invested player, come up with ways that you can give him an opportunity to use that ability in a unique way so that it feels like more than just a combat power that they cycle through a macro like they're playing EverQuest. However, what you need to do is you need to remember these things. Just like anything else, if they say it once and it never comes up again, it just becomes a wasted item. You need to write this stuff down so that it can be a callback. And then you can use it later as a way to hook the players and drag them back into the world. If they start to drift, if something's going on and, the game just doesn't feel like it's hitting on all cylinders and they don't seem like they're, really there 100%, throwing back in those little details all of a sudden can rope them right back in and turn things back around.
comes to the game world and getting the players to care about it, the same tricks apply. Let them fill in certain details. If they're all sailors on a ship, what's the name of that ship? If they all meet up at their favorite bar, then ask them what the name of the bar is. I've talked about this trick before and how I've employed it in various games over the years. Letting your players just fill in these minor details, especially about things that their characters would care about, that gives them the same sense of ownership, and it becomes easier for them to remember those details because they're the ones that named it, or they're the ones that gave this specific detail to it. But when you're introducing your players to the larger lore of the game world, maybe it's a setting that the game master has made up all on their own, or maybe it's one of those existing giant RPG settings that's got decades of in-depth history and decades of cool lore involved with it. People always ask themselves trivia, and it's kind of a status symbol of who knows the most lore about this game world. An all too common mistake that both game masters and authors make is to info dump, which is absolutely horrible to endure as a player. Not only does this kill the momentum of your game as the player's eyes glass over with a deluge of information, but chances are they're not going to remember most of this lore that you're giving them all at once. Now, personally, I hate reading game world lore. I know some people love it to death, but for me, I find it to be just the most painful thing in the world to have to read, 3,000 years of made-up history just in order to play whatever game it is I want to play. Now, some games have incredibly detailed lore, but for me, I would rather just get on with the game itself and maybe worry about the lore stuff later. Now, with Traveler, which has nearly 50 years of universe lore, my very first campaign, I didn't know any of that stuff when I ran it. I just picked up a few pieces here and there as we played. And then in my second Traveler campaign, I started getting a little bit interested in the lore, but mostly with the specific things that were pertaining to whatever my campaign was about. And then by our third Traveler campaign, I was fully invested and I started learning all the deeper lore and reading the books and everything that I could consume about the Traveler universe. So getting your players to learn the lore requires you giving it to them in much the same way as that. Give it to them very small at first, little details here and there, offer some very specific aspects that directly affect whatever the game is and whatever's going on in the game at that moment. And if the characters are not interacting with something that deals with the lore, then they really don't even need to know that stuff yet. And then as they play it, they're going to gain more and more pieces of lore until eventually your players know a lot of stuff without you having to sit down and just dump all of it to them at once. Now, all of
Yeah, a major problem with lore dumps is that they're not natural. Okay? They are not natural. One of the overarching things that is just a pure necessity to generate engagement is there has to be logical consistency. There's no logical consistency in this barkeep who knows 50,000 years worth of history in this small one-horse town. Okay? There's no logical consistency in him knowing it, and there's even less logical consistency in him sitting down and having a conversation with the players where he rattles off 50,000 years worth of history. Unless the whole thing is that's his personality quirk and he just rattles off these random old facts and stories, and there may be something of merit hidden in it. There better be something of merit to the players hidden in it. There's nothing wrong with the occasional red herring, but if you abuse that, then people just stop listening. But the operative word is not lore, it's dump. Lore dump. You can't do that. That's not how people speak. That's not the conversations you have with your friends. If your friend lore dumps on you about, you got a friend who's big into baseball and he lore dumps on you about 50 years of baseball history or 100 years of baseball history for his team, you're checked out. You might remember, oh, well, they won a bunch of World Series 20 years ago or something like that. You're not going to remember any of that because you're not invested and you don't care yet. What you have to do is make the character care first, make the player care first, and then when they dig, you give them what they're looking for.
this stuff I plan to eventually expand on in a dedicated video about lore that's also on that giant list of video ideas that I've been working on for years. But hopefully, just to kind of give a little short version of that, just to illustrate what I'm talking about, let's talk about something that I assume that most of my viewers are going to be versed in, and that's Star Wars, specifically the 1977 film. Today, Star Wars has an incredible amount of lore with over a dozen movies. Then you got all the TV shows, the novels, the comics, and all sorts of mediums out there. It is huge, but it wasn't always that big. So let's review how this expansive.
Yeah, I mean, Star Wars is a great do-don't example, and I'm sure he's probably going to touch on this because to me, it's painfully obvious. When you look at the original trilogy, things are filtered in. Little things. He's on a back world, and there's little hints about the Jedi and about the Empire and about how the rebellion against the Empire. He even about the rebellion against the Empire. It's almost like it's happening somewhere else, and the guy that Obi-Wan doesn't sit down and give him a rote dictation on the Clone Wars. And bit by bit, you start asking questions. And when you start asking questions, you start thinking. And when you start thinking, you start getting invested. You start developing things. When what you came up with as an answer to the question is right, you get excited. When it's wrong, sometimes you're like, oh man, how did I miss that? Or I see it now, or that sort of thing. Then you jump forward to the new movies, the prequel trilogy. And the worst thing about the prequel trilogy is it tried to explain everything. And it's like, no, quit trying to explain everything. Give me the pieces of information that are necessary and are practical for me to pick up from wherever I'm at in the game world. And then let me ask questions. Let me dig. Give your players that bare minimum and then watch them say, hey, I want to find out more about this Lizard King. Is there anybody here who knows anything about him? Maybe I roll a gather information or a kerosene check, or, depending on what type of game you're playing. It's okay, well, I'm going to go ask these villagers, and it's like, here's what you can find out. That is so much better than trying to spell everything out for them so that they just know.
Lore of the last 50 years was introduced to the world. We know that there's a galactic empire, there's a rebellion, there's a princess, and a mention of an imperial senate. Then once we meet Luke, we hear of a thing called the Clone Wars, but that is never ever explained what the Clone Wars is, and there's an ancient order of Jedi. Going to a bar, we find out the droids aren't allowed in there. A little detail about droids' place in society. Han has a bounty on his head from some guy named Jabba the Hutt over a dumped cargo, but no further explanation of that is given. Later, we learn the Emperor has dissolved the Senate, but that's more of a passing mention because we never see the Emperor or the Senate. We don't know the Emperor's name or anything about him. Wookiees, outside of being big and hairy, rip your arms off if they lose at a game, and womp rats, whatever the hell those are over 2 meters long. All the other stuff, the Emperor's name, the fact that the Emperor is a Sith, or what the hell a Sith is, or the fact that they always come in pairs, what a Mandalorian is, the capital of Coruscant, kyber crystals, and all that other fun stuff that even casual Star Wars fans these days now know, none of that stuff is in here. It isn't needed for this story. Now, whether George Lucas knew any of this stuff at the time or not doesn't matter. All that matters is that we, the audience, have all the necessary information that we need at that moment. And we do have hints of something more as being out there, but we don't need to know that stuff, so therefore we don't get any more information about them. This keeps your audience engaged because we have all the information that we require, and we have those little sprinklings of a much larger universe, but we don't need to know any of that stuff. So taking this all back to RPGs, Game Masters, you do not need to dump a bunch of lore onto your players all at once. The players only need whatever information that their characters require in their immediate situation. And while we do need a bit of, upfront information to help them make their characters and get an overall vibe of the game world, the rest of that stuff can just be sprinkled in as the game progresses because the player characters don't need to know this stuff. So the more that your players play, the more lore that they're naturally just going to learn as a result. And it becomes a fun experience learning all that lore rather than just a big slog of having the game master just info dump on you. Anyway, that is it for the player engagement video. And the biggest advice that reigns throughout all of these areas is having your players fill in details about their characters, certain NPCs, or even the game world. Painting a clearer picture of everything while also giving them some sort of sense of ownership over the world that we're playing in. And second, when it comes to lore, pace yourself. Let the players come to the lore rather than just you force feeding it all to them. And by keeping your players engaged means that they're more likely to keep coming back session after session and keep playing and having fun. And the more that they play, the more they're going to learn and be able to make up about this imaginary world that you all share. Till next time, gamers, you have a great day.
Okay, fantastic video there from old Seth. A lot of good stuff that's in that video. I do think there's a couple of pieces that are missed here. And that is the engagement is and I don't think they're missed in the fact that he doesn't touch on them so much as some of the meanings are missed. It's not just that they can take ownership of certain parts of your world. It also has to do with the way the human brain works. When you create something, when you build something, you are projecting something that your brain has already made and you are solidifying it. When I tell you something, you are trying to build a picture in your head with just the details I'm giving you. And since my brain does not work the way yours does, and the way I describe things is going to be processed differently than maybe the way I say it, this is where you come in with the theater, the classic theater of the mind problem, where you're going back and forth, almost arguing with the player, trying to get them to understand exactly how a bridge is shaped or a chasm works, or why you can't see the bad guys from the opening of the box canyon. And if the player is the one who is starting to put it together, you ask a few more questions, and each time it gets a sharper and sharper image. It gets more and more detailed. And that more detailed image stays fixed in their brain. So everything here, like I said, I'm not really shocked that I agree with 90% of this video. It's very rare that I have an out and out disagreement with Seth Skorkowsky on something. He's got a very similar gaming style to me and comes from a very similar place in terms of how he runs his games. So it's not shocking that there's a lot of agreement there. And I think that this one pretty much hits the nail on the head in pretty much every aspect. But you tell me below, because like I said, the way he says it makes sense to me. The things that I say make sense to me, obviously. So let's see if they make sense to you. See you guys next time.